Hello, traveler. You're tired, and it's time to rest. We've gathered by the campfire to relax and listen to ancient stories. Grab your cup of warm drink and join us. Let this starry night completely capture our attention. Once upon a time, in the vast and sprawling land of Westeros, there lived a man named Tyrion Lannister. He was small in stature, but mighty in intellect, and though many laughed at his size, he was often the smartest person in the room. Tyrion was born into the powerful Lannister family, a family known for its gold, its lands, and its ruthlessness. His father, Tywin Lannister, ruled the Westerlands with an iron fist, while his older sister, Cersei, and his brother, Jaime, were both warriors and schemers in their own rights. But Tyrion was different. He had a quick wit and a sharp tongue, and though he was often underestimated by those around him, his mind was a weapon more powerful than any sword. Yet, despite his brilliance, life in the Lannister household was not easy. His father Tywin did not hide his disappointment in his son's appearance, and his sister Cersei despised him. Only Jaime, his older brother, treated him with any kindness, though even that came with its own complications. Tyrion's life was filled with books, and he spent his days studying everything from history to strategy, learning the ways of the world through the pages of ancient texts. But one thing he knew above all else: he did not want to be known as just the imp of the Lannister family. He yearned for something more, something greater. He wanted power, and he was determined to find a way to get it, even if it meant playing the Game of Thrones. One day, the game began in earnest. His nephew, King Joffrey Baratheon, a cruel and unpredictable boy, ascended to the throne after the death of his supposed father, King Robert Baratheon. Joffrey's rise to power was not without its challenges, and soon enough his own mother, Cersei, sent for Tyrion, asking him to come to King's Landing to serve as Hand of the King. The call was an unexpected one. Tyrion had never been fond of the capital, and he certainly didn't trust his family or the court, but he knew that if he wanted to rise in the world, he needed to be where the power was, and so he packed his belongings, said goodbye to his quiet life, and set off for King's Landing with a plan in mind. As he rode through the countryside, Tyrion couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The world was changing, and not in ways that seemed to favor him. The old power structures of Westeros were crumbling, and in their place, chaos was taking hold. The threat of war hung in the air like a storm, and Tyrion knew that his family's vast wealth and influence could only protect them for so long. When Tyrion finally arrived at King's Landing, the sight of the capital left him in awe. The Red Keep loomed large over the city, its towers reaching high into the sky. But beneath the grandeur and beauty of the city, there was a darkness. The streets were crowded with poor and hungry people, and the court was filled with intrigue and whispers. Tyrion could feel the weight of the place, the sense that everything here was a game that could cost him more than just his life if he wasn't careful. He made his way through the castle, past guards and servants, until he reached the throne room. There, in all his glory, sat King Joffrey, a boy of only 12, but with the arrogance and cruelty of a man twice his age. Joffrey's eyes gleamed with malice as he stared at Tyrion, and for a moment, Tyrion felt a pang of fear, but only for a moment. Tyrion had learned long ago that fear was a weakness, and he had no intention of showing any to a boy who could barely hold his crown. He stood tall despite his small stature, and met Joffrey's gaze. "Your Grace," Tyrion said with a bow, his voice steady and calm. "I have come to serve you." Joffrey's lips curled into a smile, but it was a smile full of malice. "And I've heard much about you, uncle," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "The clever little imp who thinks he knows everything." Tyrion smiled back, a touch of humor in his eyes. "I do know a few things," he said, "but I wouldn't call myself clever, only lucky." Joffrey's smile faded slightly, but Tyrion didn't let it faze him. He had been in the presence of more dangerous men than a bratty king, and he knew how to handle himself. He had learned the hard way that power in King's Landing was all about perception. If you showed weakness, you were finished. But if you played your cards right, if you knew when to speak and when to be silent, then you could survive, even thrive. And survive, Tyrion Lannister would. He had no intention of being a mere pawn in his family's games. He was going to carve his own path to power, one carefully calculated move at a time. As he left the throne room that day, Tyrion's mind was already racing. There were alliances to be made, enemies to outwit, and plots to uncover. Tyrion had come to King's Landing not just to serve as Hand of the King, but to take control of his own destiny. The road ahead would not be easy, and it would be filled with challenges that would test him in ways he could not yet imagine. But one thing was certain. Tyrion Lannister was going to play the Game of Thrones, and he was going to win. The great halls of the Red Keep echoed with the weight of history, and Tyrion Lannister, though small in stature, walked with the deliberate confidence of someone who had spent years studying the intricacies of power and survival. The cold stone beneath his boots was worn smooth by the countless feet that had passed through these corridors, feet of kings, queens, soldiers, and thieves alike. And yet, to Tyrion, the coldness of the castle was not merely physical. It was the atmosphere that pervaded every stone and beam, a chilling reminder that nothing in King's Landing was ever truly safe, not even for those who thought themselves in power. As he moved deeper into the Red Keep, Tyrion felt the weight of its walls closing in, as though the very air was thick with centuries of ambition, treachery, and blood. There was something oppressive about the place, something that made every step feel heavier than the last. It was not just the smell of old stone and the faint tang of incense in the air, nor the flickering torchlight casting long, wavering shadows on the walls. It was the knowledge that here every moment was a game, and only the most cunning survived. But even in the midst of this oppressive atmosphere, Tyrion found solace in his own mind. He was, after all, a man who had spent his life learning how to play the Game of Thrones. His sharp intellect had been honed in the quiet of his books and the solitude of his thoughts. While others were blinded by the pursuit of power, Tyrion understood that power was never about force. It was about perception. It was about knowing when to speak, when to listen, and, most importantly, when to wait. When he entered the throne room once more, the sight of King Joffrey seated upon the Iron Throne was almost comical in its irony. The boy barely fit into the enormous chair, which had been forged from the swords of defeated enemies, and yet he sat there as though the weight of the crown were not just a physical burden, but a symbol of his support. Joffrey's arrogance was palpable, and Tyrion could see it in the way the boy's eyes gleamed, a predatory gleam that reminded him of the hounds that roamed the streets of King's Landing, wild, untrained, and dangerously unpredictable. Tyrion approached, his steps measured and deliberate, the sound of his boots barely audible against the cold stone floor. The throne room was vast, its high ceilings adorned with intricate tapestries depicting battles long past, heroes long forgotten. The walls themselves seemed to breathe with the weight of 1,000 years of history, as though they too had been watching the game unfold, waiting for the next player to make their move. Joffrey looked down at him with disdain, as though Tyrion were an insect to be crushed underfoot. "So, uncle," he sneered, his voice high-pitched and full of arrogance, "how does it feel to serve me, to be in the presence of greatness?" Tyrion's lips curled into a faint smile, though there was no humor in his eyes. He could feel the venom in Joffrey's words, and he knew that the boy's cruelty was not just a reflection of his own nature, but a tool, a way to keep others beneath him. But Tyrion had learned long ago that cruelty was a weakness, a sign of insecurity. It was a facade to hide one's fears, and Tyrion was determined to strip away that facade, piece by piece. He raised an eyebrow and took a step closer, his gaze unwavering. "Greatness?" he repeated, his voice smooth and measured. "You speak of greatness as though it's something that can be inherited, something that comes with a crown. But I've seen many men who wore crowns, Joffrey, men who thought themselves invincible, only to find that power is a fragile thing, easily shattered. Greatness, my dear nephew, is not a birthright. It is earned. It is built on wisdom, patience, and, above all, the ability to see beyond one's own arrogance." Joffrey's face flushed with anger, his hands gripping the arms of the throne as though he could tear it apart with his bare hands. "How dare you?" he began, but Tyrion interrupted him, his voice soft but firm. "How dare I speak the truth?" Tyrion asked, tilting his head as though he were considering the question. "Perhaps you are right, Joffrey. Perhaps it is not my place to teach you about greatness. But consider this. What good is a throne if the people you rule despise you? What good is power if you are surrounded by enemies, all waiting for the moment to strike?" Joffrey opened his mouth to retort, but Tyrion raised a hand to silence him. "You see, Joffrey, power is like a flame. It can warm you, it can light your way, but it can also burn you if you're not careful. And those who seek to wield power without understanding it, without understanding the hearts of the people, without understanding their own weaknesses, are doomed to be consumed by it." The room fell silent, the tension palpable. The air seemed to thicken, as though even the walls were holding their breath. Tyrion's words hung in the air, and for a brief moment Joffrey seemed to falter. But then, as quickly as it had come, the moment passed, and Joffrey's scowl returned. "I don't need your lessons, uncle," he spat, his voice dripping with contempt. "I will rule this kingdom as I see fit, and anyone who stands in my way will pay the price." Tyrion's smile remained, though there was little warmth in it. "We shall see, Joffrey. We shall see." As he turned to leave the throne room, the weight of the Iron Throne seemed to press down on him once more. Tyrion had never desired the throne for himself, not in the way his family did, but in that moment he couldn't help but wonder, what would it be like to sit on that throne, to hold the power that it promised, and to see the world through the eyes of a king? He knew that the throne was not just a seat, it was a symbol of dominance, of control. It was also a trap, a gilded cage that could destroy a man from within. And Tyrion Lannister was not one to be destroyed. The night in King's Landing was a cold one. The city, wrapped in the grip of winter's approach, seemed to hold its breath. The wind howled through the narrow streets, carrying with it the scent of salt from the distant seas and the faint whisper of distant storms on the horizon. The stars above were dimmed by the ever-present glow of torchlight that flickered along the city's walls, casting long shadows over the cobbled streets. It was a city of stone and iron, of ambition and greed, where power was both a treasure and a curse, always teetering on the edge of destruction. As Tyrion walked through the dimly lit corridors of the Red Keep, He couldn't shake the weight of the city's silence. King's Landing was a place that pulsed with danger, yet there was something unnerving about the stillness that clung to the halls at night. The creaking of ancient wooden beams, the soft flutter of tapestries brushing against the stone walls, the distant murmur of guards as they walked their patrols. All of it blended together in a haunting symphony. The castle itself seemed alive, breathing with the rhythm of its past, and Tyrion couldn't help but feel a pang of unease. He had always found comfort in the silence of his own thoughts, but here, within the walls of the Red Keep, silence was more of a companion than a comfort. It was a reminder that nothing here was ever truly still, that the game was never over, no matter how much one wished for peace. Tyrion paused in front of his chambers, the heavy door creaking open as he pushed it with a touch of his hand. His room was sparsely decorated, as was his custom, with only the necessities filling the space. A large bed, its heavy embroidered curtains pulled back, a desk cluttered with papers, and a few bookshelves that lined the walls. The only thing that seemed out of place in the otherwise utilitarian space was a single window, which looked out over the city and the vast sea beyond. It was through this window that Tyrion often found solace, staring out over the waters, the moonlight dancing on the waves. But tonight, even that comfort seemed distant, as though the world outside had become a place of uncertainty. He moved to the desk, where a letter from his father lay, untouched. The words on the parchment were as sharp and unforgiving as always, a reminder that Tywin Lannister would never let his son forget his place. "You may be clever, Tyrion," the letter said, "but you are still my son, and you are still beneath me." The words stung, though Tyrion had grown accustomed to them over the years. His father's disdain had always been something he carried with him, like a burden he could never fully rid himself of. But the weight of that burden had changed over the years. It was no longer a reminder of his inferiority. It had become fuel for his ambition, a drive to prove his worth not to his father, but to the world itself. With a soft sigh, Tyrion folded the letter and placed it in the drawer of his desk. He had little time for his father's opinions now. There were more pressing matters to consider. The game was no longer just about survival, it was about control. And for all the power that his family held, for all the gold they possessed, Tyrion knew that they were only as strong as the alliances they could forge, the enemies they could outwit, and above all, the secrets they could keep hidden. As he sat down, his mind wandered back to the throne room, to Joffrey's cruel face, to the fire in the boy's eyes when he had spoken of ruling the kingdom. Tyrion knew that the Iron Throne was not just a seat, it was a symbol of control, of absolute power, and Joffrey, for all his arrogance and cruelty, was a boy who had inherited that power, not earned it. There was a difference, Tyrion thought, between ruling with fear and ruling with wisdom. One was bound to burn itself out. The other could last for generations. Joffrey, with his impulsive nature and unchecked emotions, was a ruler who would not last long. But that didn't mean he would fall quietly. No, Joffrey's fall would be as dramatic as his rise, and Tyrion had no intention of getting caught in the flames when it happened. The sound of footsteps outside his door pulled Tyrion from his thoughts. He stood and walked over, opening the door to reveal his servant, Podrick, standing awkwardly in the hallway. Podrick had become more than just a servant to Tyrion. He was a loyal ally, someone who, despite his shyness and lack of experience, had proven his worth in small but significant ways. "Lord Tyrion," Podrick said, his voice trembling slightly, "there is someone here to see you. A woman, she says it's urgent." Tyrion raised an eyebrow. The world of King's Landing was filled with urgent matters, but few of them came with the promise of importance. "A woman?" he asked, his curiosity piqued. "What is her name?" "She did not give it, my lord," Podrick replied, "but she insisted that you would recognize her. She says it is a matter of great importance." Tyrion sighed. "Very well," he said, stepping back from the door. "Let her in." Moments later, a woman entered the room, and Tyrion's heart skipped a beat. She was tall and slender, her dark hair cascading down her back in soft waves. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, locked onto his as she stepped into the room. She was dressed simply, in a dark cloak that seemed to blend into the shadows, but there was an air about her that screamed of nobility, of someone who belonged to the world of politics and intrigue. It was a world that Tyrion knew all too well. "Lord Tyrion," she said, her voice low but confident, "I have come to offer you a warning." Tyrion studied her, his mind racing. He had learned long ago to be wary of those who came bearing warnings. But something about her seemed different. Something about her presence felt familiar. She was not a stranger to this world, and that alone made her dangerous. "A warning?" Tyrion repeated, his voice smooth but laced with curiosity. "And what sort of warning might that be?" The woman glanced around the room, her eyes lingering on the open window, then back to him. "You are playing a dangerous game, Lord Lannister. There are forces at work in this city, forces that would see you destroyed. You may think you are safe, that your family's gold will protect you, but gold is nothing in a game where the stakes are life and death." Tyrion leaned forward, his interest piqued. "I have played many games, my lady," he said softly, "but I'm afraid I'm not one for riddles. Who sent you here?" The woman hesitated, her eyes shifting as though weighing her next words. "Someone who knows the game better than you," she replied. "Someone who has been watching you, Tyrion Lannister, and they want you to succeed. But to do so, you will need to be more than just clever. You will need to trust those around you, your allies, and be prepared to make choices that may not be easy." Tyrion sat back in his chair, his mind already racing with possibilities. The web of politics in King's Landing was thick with lies and deceit, and anyone who claimed to be his ally was likely to have their own agenda. But this woman, with her sharp eyes and quiet confidence, intrigued him. She spoke with a knowledge that hinted at a deeper understanding of the game than most. "Tell me more," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. But before she could answer, the door to his chambers burst open, and a sudden gust of wind blew through the room, extinguishing the candles and leaving the space in darkness. The room was plunged into a suffocating darkness, the flames of the candles flickering out in an instant, as though the very air of the Red Keep had conspired to silence their presence. The wind that swept through the open window carried with it a chill, one that bit through Tyrion's cloak and reminded him with cruel clarity of the world outside. His mind raced with thoughts of the woman who had just spoken, her cryptic words lingering like an echo in his ears. The silence that followed felt oppressive, as though the very walls of his chambers were closing in, pressing against him with the weight of unanswered questions and unspoken threats. For a moment Tyrion was still, his thoughts turned inward, his mind a swirling maelstrom of calculations, memories, and fleeting doubts. What had she meant? She had spoken with the surety of someone who knew more than she let on, and yet there was a subtle hesitation in her voice that betrayed her uncertainty. Could she be trusted? Tyrion had long since learned that trust was a currency more precious than gold in this city of liars and schemers, and he had never been one to give it freely. But this woman, there was something about her that felt different, as if she were more than just a messenger, more than just a pawn in some greater game. The darkness that enveloped the room seemed to press harder against him, the air growing thick and heavy, as though the walls themselves were aware of his unease. The distant sound of wind howling through the streets below added an eerie, mournful quality to the atmosphere, and Tyrion's thoughts turned once again to the city that surrounded him, King's Landing, a city of treachery, of whispered secrets, and hidden knives. The city, like its rulers, was a place of paradoxes. On the surface it seemed a hub of power and prosperity, but beneath that gleaming facade there was a rotting core, one that gnawed at the heart of every man, woman, and child who called it home. Tyrion's hand brushed over the desk, feeling the smooth surface of the wood beneath his fingertips, as though it could ground him in a reality that was slipping further from his grasp. He had come here to serve as hand of the king, to navigate the labyrinth of politics and deceit. But the more he delved into the depths of the game, the more he found himself lost within its tangled web. There were no simple answers in King's Landing, no clear lines between ally and enemy, only shifting shadows and ever-changing allegiances. It was a place where trust was as fragile as glass, and once it was shattered, it could never truly be repaired. The sound of footsteps approaching broke the silence, and Tyrion turned toward the door, his thoughts momentarily displaced by the familiar noise. His eyes narrowed in the darkness, his keen mind already calculating the possibilities. Who would come to him at this hour, after the cryptic warning from the woman? Was it someone with an answer, or someone with another question to ask? The door creaked open, the flickering light from the hall casting long, distorted shadows on the walls, and in the doorway stood none other than Varys the Spider, the master of whispers, his face as inscrutable as always. Varys stepped into the room, his dark robes trailing behind him, the soft rustle of fabric the only sound that accompanied his movements. The dim light illuminated his face, and Tyrion was struck, as always, by the sheer calmness of Varys's expression, as though he were a man who had seen everything there was to see and had long ago stopped being surprised by the cruelty of the world. His gaze was steady, his eyes reflecting the faint glimmer of the candles that now flickered back to life, casting their warm glow across the room. But there was something in his eyes, something in the subtle shift of his posture, that suggested he, too, had felt the weight of the words spoken by the mysterious woman. "Lord Tyrion," Varys said, his voice low, almost a whisper, as though speaking too loudly might disturb the fragile balance of the room. "It seems there is much at work here, and I find myself curious." Tyrion studied the man carefully, his sharp mind piecing together the fragments of information that had come his way over the past few days. Varys, for all his many talents, was a creature of subtlety, never revealing too much, never allowing his true intentions to be known. He was a man of shadows, a spider weaving his web, but Tyrion had always believed that no one, no matter how skilled, could keep their web hidden forever. "What is it you're curious about, Varys?" Tyrion asked, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of caution. "There is always something, isn't there?" Varys allowed a small smile to tug at the corners of his lips, but it was a smile devoid of humor, one that seemed more like a gesture of acknowledgement than anything else. "Indeed, Lord Tyrion," he said, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. "There is always something, and tonight I find myself wondering about the many paths that lead to power. The Iron Throne, for example, so many eyes upon it, yet so few understand the game that must be played to claim it. I wonder." Varys paused, his fingers lightly tapping the edge of the desk. if you have considered the cost of playing such a game." Tyrion's gaze sharpened. "The cost, Varys?" he repeated, his tone measured but with a faint edge of challenge. "I'm well aware of the cost. It is a price paid by all who seek power. Some lose their lives, some lose their souls, and some lose both. But it is a price I am willing to pay." Varys studied him carefully, his eyes calculating as though weighing every word Tyrion had spoken. "And yet," he said slowly, "even the most powerful men can be undone by their own pride, their own miscalculations. You, Lord Tyrion, have proven time and time again that you are not driven by pride. You are a man of reason, of logic. But the throne, it has a way of twisting the minds of even the most reasonable of men, and once that twist takes hold, there is no telling what one will sacrifice in the pursuit of it." Tyrion stood still for a long moment, his fingers brushing against the edge of the desk, his mind racing through the words that Varys had spoken. There was a part of him that agreed with the eunuch's assessment. The throne did indeed have a way of corrupting those who sought it, of turning them into something they had never imagined they could be. And yet, there was another part of him, a darker part, that was drawn to it, as if it were a magnet, pulling him inexorably toward its cold, unyielding seat. "I have no illusions about the throne, Varys," Tyrion said at last, his voice tinged with something between amusement and weariness. "I know that it is not a seat for the weak, but neither is it a seat for the foolish. I do not seek it for its own sake. I seek it because I know what it can do, what it can give. Power is a tool, and tools are meant to be used." Varys nodded, his face unreadable, but there was a flicker of something, perhaps respect, beneath his calm exterior. "You are a man of wisdom, Lord Tyrion," he said softly, "but even wisdom has its limits. Be careful, for the path you walk is treacherous, and the webs you spin may entangle you before you even realize it." Tyrion's lips curled into a smile, though it was a smile that held no warmth. "I have no intention of being caught in anyone's web, Varys," he said, his voice steady. "But I do intend to ensure that the web I weave is one that holds the world in place. And if that means playing the game, then so be it." Varys tilted his head slightly, as though considering this new revelation. "Indeed, Lord Tyrion," he murmured, "so be it." The silence returned, but this time it was not oppressive. It was the silence of two men, both players in the Game of Thrones, both aware of the dangers that lay ahead, yet neither willing to turn back. The night grew heavier, thick with the tension of unsaid words and unspoken truths. The dim flicker of the remaining candles cast long, wavering shadows across the room, distorting the shape of objects and creating a dance of light and dark that seemed to mirror the turmoil in Tyrion's mind. The air was damp with the residual chill of the evening, yet there was something intoxicating about the stillness, as though the world outside had paused, holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. Even the wind, which had once howled through the streets of King's Landing with an unsettling shriek, seemed subdued, as if it too had been lulled into quiet contemplation by the conversations that echoed within the walls of the Red Keep. Tyrion stood at the window now, his back to Varys, but his mind engaged with the eunuch's words, each one slipping into place like a carefully laid stone in a far more complex structure. The shadows of the city outside stretched out before him, the faint glimmer of torchlight from the streets below casting a golden hue upon the darkened water of Blackwater Bay, The city felt alive, its heartbeat a constant hum beneath the weight of its stone walls, its towers stretching toward the heavens like sentinels, guarding the secrets of the realm. The Iron Throne stood at the center of it all, glorious and grotesque, sharp and unyielding, a seat of power that promised everything and demanded everything in return. Tyrion's thoughts were a whirlwind, tumbling from one idea to another, never resting, never stopping long enough for any of them to take full shape. Power was a concept that consumed him, and as much as he despised the cruelty and manipulation that it demanded, he couldn't help but be drawn to it. What else was there in a world like this, where the strong ruled and the weak perished? He had learned early in life that survival was not about brute strength or force of will. It was about perception. It was about knowing how to play the game, how to weave a story that others would believe, and then, when the time was right, how to change the story to suit your needs. But even more than that, it was about understanding the intricacies of those who sought power for themselves. The game wasn't just about surviving, it was about understanding the player, and Tyrion had a gift for that. One he wasn't sure even Varys could match. He turned slowly, his eyes meeting Varys's once more. The eunuch was still standing there, his posture unchanged, his expression as unreadable as ever. The flickering candlelight illuminated his face, but there was no warmth to it, no soft glow. It was cold, impartial, much like the man himself. But there was something more beneath the surface, something deeper, darker. Tyrion had spent enough time in King's Landing to recognize when someone was playing a game of their own, even if they weren't showing their cards. Varys's words had been measured, careful, but there had been an underlying sense of caution in them, an implication that there was more at stake here than either of them was willing to admit. Tyrion's mind raced, turning over each word, each gesture, as he tried to piece together the larger picture. "Varys," he said finally, his voice steady but carrying the weight of unspoken thoughts. "You speak of the game as though it were something inevitable, something that cannot be escaped. But I wonder, do you ever tire of it? Do you ever wonder what lies beyond the webs we weave, beyond the lies we tell ourselves?" Varys' expression did not change, but his eyes seemed to flicker just for a moment. It was almost imperceptible, a brief lapse in his usual control, but Tyrion caught it. The eunuch took a step forward, his voice soft but filled with an unsettling depth. "Lord Tyrion," Varys began, his tone calm but resonating with a quiet weight. "You, of all people, should understand the nature of the game. I have seen the way power shapes a man, how it molds him and bends him until he no longer knows himself. You ask if I tire of it. I suppose in a way I do. I have lived with the shadows for so long that it has become second nature. But I also know that, much like the sun rises and sets, the game will never cease. It will continue long after we are gone, long after the names we hold so dearly have faded into dust. It is not about personal desire, Tyrion. It is about survival. Power is not a choice. It is a necessity." Tyrion leaned against the stone windowsill, his fingers curling around the cold stone as the weight of Varys's words settled over him. It was true in a way. He had lived through the brutality of Westeros long enough to know that power was a currency that could not be avoided. The strong ruled, the cunning survived, and the naive perished. But still, a part of him balked at the thought of this being his fate. He had never been one to accept things as they were. He had always sought to shape them, to challenge the status quo. And yet, here he was, standing in the heart of the Red Keep, a place where power was as much a force of nature as the air they breathed, unable to escape the truth of Varys's words. The game, Tyrion mused aloud, his voice drifting like smoke, is not just about winning, is it? It's about understanding the price. We speak of power as though it's something we can own, something we can wield like a sword, but in truth, it is something that owns us. The more we chase it, the more it consumes us. And what happens when we reach the throne? What happens when we have everything we want, but we are no longer the same men who set out to claim it? Varys studied him closely, his lips curling into a slight, knowing smile. "Ah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're beginning to understand. The game is not about the throne, Lord Tyrion. It is about the journey, the choices we make along the way, the sacrifices we are willing to endure. The throne is merely a symbol, a prize that promises everything and gives nothing. It is a reflection of all that we have lost, all that we have become in pursuit of our desire." Tyrion's eyes narrowed, his mind racing as the enormity of the eunuch's words began to sink in. There was something profoundly unsettling in them, something that echoed in the deepest corners of his soul. He had always known that power came at a price, but hearing it from Varys, the master of secrets, the architect of plots, somehow made it feel more real, more immediate. It was as if the weight of the entire world rested on his shoulders, pressing down, reminding him that the very path he had chosen was one from which there was no turning back. "And yet," Tyrion said, his voice dropping to a murmur, as if he were speaking more to himself than to Varys, "I find it impossible to turn away. It is a disease, isn't it? This thirst for power. We tell ourselves that we are driven by necessity, by duty, by some higher calling, but the truth is far simpler, far darker. We are driven by a desire for control, to be the master of our own fate, to shape the world around us, even as it seeks to break us." Varys regarded him quietly, his expression unreadable, but his eyes seemed to reflect a quiet understanding, as though he had heard this all before. "Indeed," he said softly, "it is a disease, and it is one that we all must bear, for to survive in this world, we must play the game. There is no escape from it, Tyrion. There is only the choice of how we play." Tyrion stood in silence for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant city below. The night had deepened and the stars were hidden behind a veil of clouds, but somewhere beyond the walls of the Red Keep, beyond the turmoil and intrigue of King's Landing, the world still turned. And in that world, Tyrion knew, the game would continue. Relentless, unforgiving, and always waiting for the next move. But for now he remained in the shadows, watching, waiting, and learning the rules that would one day bring him to the throne. The Red Keep, with its high, imposing walls and endless corridors, seemed like a living thing, breathing and shifting with the weight of its centuries, old history. As Tyrion moved through the dimly lit halls, each step echoed like a soft reminder that he was but one player in a much larger game, a game that had been unfolding long before he had ever set foot in the capital. The walls, covered in faded tapestries that told stories of ancient kings and long-forgotten battles, whispered their secrets into the darkness. The flickering torchlight cast long, jagged shadows that seemed to twist and turn with each step, as if the very air within the Red Keep was alive with the ghosts of those who had come before. The weight of the place settled around Tyrion, pressing in on him, and for the first time since arriving in King's Landing, he felt a sense of isolation, not just from his family, but from the world outside. The halls, cold and cavernous, seemed to swallow him whole, leaving him with nothing but his own thoughts for company. It was a feeling he was accustomed to, this loneliness, this quiet isolation, but it felt different here, somehow. In King's Landing there was no room for true solitude, for even in the quietest moments, there was always someone watching, someone waiting to see how the game would unfold. The castle itself seemed to reflect the very nature of power in Westeros, imposing, jagged, and filled with hidden dangers lurking in the corners. As Tyrion made his way deeper into the heart of the keep, the oppressive silence hung heavily around him, like a shroud, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for the next move to be made. As he approached the small chamber that had become his personal refuge, he could feel the weight of his own thoughts pressing down on him, as though every decision, every word, every action had led him to this very moment. The Iron Throne, that cursed seat of power, loomed ever larger in his mind, not as something to be coveted, but as something to be feared. Tyrion had never been one for ambition in the way that his sister Cersei or his brother Jaime were, yet there was something deeply seductive about the idea of power, the sense that in one moment you could control everything and everyone around you. But he knew better than anyone that the price of that power was steep, and for those who sought it too eagerly, the consequences could be devastating. He entered his room and moved slowly to the large, arched window that overlooked the city. The moonlight spilled into the room, its pale glow illuminating the shadows and casting them in sharp contrast. The world outside, though beautiful in its quiet stillness, felt distant to Tyrion. King's Landing, with all its wealth and grandeur, had never been a home to him. It was a place of treachery, of scheming and plotting, where every whispered word could alter the course of history. It was a place where you could either rise to unimaginable heights or fall into the abyss with a single misstep. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door, and before he could respond, Podrick Payne, his loyal squire, entered the room. Podrick was a quiet, earnest boy, still learning the ways of the world, but his loyalty to Tyrion was unwavering, and that alone made him more valuable than any of the noblemen who had passed through the Red Keep's halls. Podrick's presence was a comfort to Tyrion in a world that often felt cold and indifferent, a reminder that, even in the midst of all the chaos, there were still those who cared. "Lord Tyrion," Podrick said, his voice soft but steady. "The Queen, she requests your presence at once. She says it's urgent." Tyrion's brow furrowed at the mention of Cersei. His sister, the Queen Regent, was a woman of unpredictable moods and sharp edges, and he knew better than to ignore a summons from her. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to her request, something behind her words that she was not saying. His sister's machinations were as complex as any game of chess, and Tyrion had learned long ago to read between the lines of her words. "I'll be there shortly," he replied, his voice calm, though his mind was already turning over the possibilities of what she could want. He had learned through bitter experience that Cersei never summoned him unless there was something to gain, either for her or for the family. She was not one for sentimentality. Everything she did was a calculated move in the Game of Thrones, and Tyrion, for all his intelligence, had long ago accepted that he was merely a piece on her chessboard, a pawn to be moved when it suited her. As Tyrion made his way to the throne room, the corridors seemed to close in around him, their stone walls pressing against him, as though the very fabric of the Red Keep was conspiring to hold him in place. The torches flickered in the dark, their flames dancing in the drafts that swept through the halls. The air felt thick with the weight of secrets, and the silence between each step seemed to stretch on forever, as though the castle itself was holding its breath, waiting for him to reach his sister. The throne room was a place of grandeur, its high vaulted ceilings adorned with intricate tapestries depicting the history of the Lannister family and their many victories. The floor was a polished stone, smooth and cold underfoot, and the Iron Throne itself loomed at the far end of the room, a jagged and intimidating seat of power forged from the swords of conquered kings. It was a throne that demanded respect, not through beauty or elegance, but through its sheer, brutal presence. Tyrion had never been one for the grandeur of the throne. It was an instrument of power, not a symbol of honor. But as he entered the room, his eyes were drawn to it, as they always were. There was something magnetic about it, something that whispered to him, even as it repelled him. Susie stood at the foot of the throne, her back straight, her expression one of controlled fury. She was a woman of formidable presence, with a beauty that could both enchant and intimidate, a beauty that was always accompanied by a cold, calculating intelligence. Her gaze locked on to Tyrion's as he entered the room, and for a brief moment he saw a flicker of something in her eyes, something that was almost uncertain. "Why do you look at me like that, Tyrion?" she asked, her voice laced with suspicion and sharpness. "You've come, but you come with no answers, no understanding of what is at stake." Tyrion paused, his mind racing as he considered her words. His sister was a master of manipulation, and every conversation with her was a delicate dance, a careful negotiation of power. He had learned long ago that the best way to deal with Circe was not with force, but with subtlety. He chose his words carefully, knowing that even the slightest misstep could set her off. "I look at you as I always have, Circe," he replied, his tone calm but edged with the experience of years spent navigating her moods. "As a woman who has never learned to share power, who believes that every move she makes is in her best interest, but who always forgets that there are others who play this game just as carefully. You may wear the crown, but you do not wear the throne." Cersei's face tightened, her lips curling into a thin line. "You think I need your lessons?" she spat. "Your sarcasm and your tricks, your cleverness, which has never amounted to anything more than the protection of your own pathetic existence." Tyrion met her gaze without flinching, knowing that the venom in her words was born from fear of losing control, of being overshadowed by those who could see beyond the obvious. "You mistake my words, as you always do," Tyrion said softly, his voice now carrying a different weight, one that was less defensive and more contemplative. "I do not seek to diminish you, Circe. I seek to remind you that the world is full of threats that cannot be ignored. The crown you wear is not a shield. It is a target." Cersei's eyes flashed with fury, but for the briefest moment, Tyrion saw something more, something deeper than her usual bluster. It was fear, barely contained beneath her anger, a fear of the unknown, of what might come for her and for her children. But that was a fear Tyrion had come to know well, the fear that had driven his own choices in life. "You think the world will bend to you, Tyrion," she said, her voice quieter now, but still tinged with contempt. You think you can control everything with your clever words, your manipulation, your endless strategies. But there is more to power than your mind. There is heart. And the heart of this kingdom beats for one thing: survival. You will understand that soon enough. Tyrion felt a chill in the air, a heaviness that seemed to settle deeper into the very stone of the room. Cersei had spoken the truth, but in a way she had also revealed a weakness, a crack in her armor that he could exploit. The game was no longer just about survival for him, nor was it about mere cunning. It was about understanding the motivations of those who held power, the fears they carried with them, and the weaknesses they kept hidden beneath their pride. As he stood there facing his sister, he realized that the game he was playing was far more complicated than he had imagined, and the stakes were higher than ever. The throne room, despite its grandeur, was an oddly cold place to Tyrion. The towering walls, lined with massive stone pillars, seemed to swallow the warmth of the room, and the immense windows high above let in only the barest slivers of light. The faint traces of a distant setting sun filtered through the cracked glass, casting an ethereal glow across the room, but it was the kind of light that felt distant and unreachable, as if the very idea of warmth had been drained from the room itself. The Iron Throne, with its jagged, cruel edges and countless blades forged in the fires of past conquests, loomed in the far corner like a monument to ambition. A throne built not to comfort, but to intimidate. Tyrion couldn't help but think that it was a throne designed to devour its occupants, to bend them into the shape of a ruler without mercy or understanding. As he stood before it now, with Cersei's fiery gaze locked on him, he couldn't shake the feeling that every moment in this room was a carefully staged performance, every movement weighed down by the knowledge that the very air was thick with politics and unspoken desires. The floor beneath him was cold, smooth marble, and the sharp echoes of his footsteps reverberated off the walls, further amplifying the tension that hung in the room like a storm ready to break. Even the scent of the room, the musty smell of old stone, mingled with the faint trace of incense that clung to the air, seemed to whisper of the passage of time, of the power that had passed through these halls for centuries, leaving behind only its ghostly echoes. Tyrion knew without a doubt that his sister was playing the game just as viciously as ever, but what had changed in the years since his return to King's Landing? The anger in her voice was familiar, yet beneath it there was something different now, a sense of desperation, of a woman trapped in a web of her own making. He could feel it in her every movement, every word, every glance she cast his way. The power that she clung to so tightly was no longer something she could control with ease. And Tyrion wondered, in that quiet corner of his mind that was always watching and analyzing, whether the cracks in her armor were already visible to everyone else. He let the silence settle between them, choosing his next words carefully, knowing that in this game every misstep could lead to a fall. "Cersei," he said at last, his voice a touch more contemplative than he intended, "you always speak of power as though it were something that could be possessed like a trinket, something that can be held, displayed, and admired. But the truth of power is far more elusive. It is like a flame, something that can warm but also burn, something that can be snuffed out with a single gust of wind, or become a wildfire, consuming everything it touches." Cersei's lips tightened at his words, but she didn't interrupt. Tyrion could see the tension in her posture, the way she stood so rigidly in front of the throne, as though the weight of it pressed down on her in a way that even she couldn't fully control. Her eyes, usually so quick to anger, flickered with a momentary uncertainty, and Tyrion could almost feel the vulnerability that she tried so desperately to keep hidden. "You speak of power," Tyrion continued, his words now slower, more deliberate. "But what is power really? Is it a crown, a throne, a name? Or is it something else altogether? A force, a drive, an insatiable hunger that can never be sated? And more importantly, is it worth the cost? Because, my dear sister, I know better than anyone what the price of power is. I've paid it with my very soul, just as you have." Cersei's gaze hardened again, but there was no venom in it now. Only the weight of years spent chasing a dream that had turned into a nightmare. "You think you understand power, Tyrion? You think that your clever words and your tricks have given you some deeper insight into the nature of it? You have never sat on the Iron Throne, never worn the crown. You have never felt the weight of a kingdom resting on your shoulders, the lives of thousands hanging by a thread, the constant pressure to remain strong, to remain resolute, even when every part of you wants to break." She took a step closer to him, her voice low but fierce, her words laced with the kind of pain that only someone who had been crushed under the weight of their own ambition could understand. "You think that I don't know the cost of power? That I don't understand the sacrifices that have to be made? I have lost everything for this, Tyrion. I have lost my children, my family, my very soul to this throne, and you stand here, lecturing me as though you have all the answers." Tyrion's chest tightened at the rawness of her words, but he didn't let it show. Instead, he met her gaze, his own eyes steady. "I never said I had the answers, Cersei. I only know what the game demands. I know that in this world you are either a player or a pawn, and I intend to be a player. But I also know that there's a price to pay for everything. For every victory, for every triumph, there is a sacrifice. And I'm starting to wonder, sister, whether the price you've paid for this crown is one that you'll ever be able to pay back." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and unspoken, as though the room itself had taken a breath and was holding it, waiting for Cersei's next move. Her expression was unreadable, her face frozen in a mask of stoic determination, but Tyrion could see the way her fingers tightened around the armrests of the throne, as if she were holding on for dear life, afraid that she might slip and fall. For a moment the silence stretched, and Tyrion found himself considering her words more deeply than he had in years. What did it mean to hold power? To possess it, to command it? Could anyone truly wield the Iron Throne without being consumed by it? He had seen men rise and fall in its shadow, had watched as those who thought themselves invincible were shattered by their own ambition, and he had come to realize in the quiet recesses of his own mind that power in its purest form was not about control. It was about understanding the fragility of that control, the way it slipped from your fingers no matter how tightly you clutched it. Perhaps that was the true cost of power, not the sacrifices made to attain it, but the realization that, in the end, it was always fleeting, and those who sought it for the wrong reasons, those who sought it to fill an emptiness, to prove something to the world, were the ones most likely to be undone by it. Cersei's voice broke the silence, quiet now, but laced with the same sharp edge as before. "You are wrong, Tyrion," she said, her tone low but filled with a conviction that came from deep within. "You speak of power as though it were a fleeting thing, something that can be held only so long before it slips away. But I know better. Power is not something you simply take, something you wield until it breaks. Power is something you take and make your own. It is not the crown, not the throne. It is the people who bow to you, the ones who fall to their knees when you command. It is about creating something that lasts, something that will never break." Tyrion studied her for a long moment, and in that silence he wondered if she truly understood what she was saying. Could power ever truly last? Could it ever be something that didn't eventually consume those who sought it? Or was Cersei simply too blinded by her ambition to see the danger in the way she clung to it, like a desperate man clutching a lifeline that was slowly pulling him deeper into the sea? He shook his head slightly, his voice quiet but resolute. "You are right about one thing, Cersei. Power is something we create, something we make our own. But it is also something that can destroy us if we aren't careful. And in the end, that is the greatest sacrifice of all. The loss of everything we once were, in exchange for something we may never truly possess." Cersei's eyes narrowed, but Tyrion could see the flicker of something else there, something that perhaps even she had not been fully aware of. For a moment she was silent, and in that silence, Tyrion realized that the game, for all its cruelty and danger, had only just begun, and the cost of playing it, for both of them, was a price neither was fully prepared to pay. The weight of the conversation lingered in the throne room long after Cersei had departed, her steps echoing down the stone corridors as if the very walls were reluctant to let her go. Tyrion stood at the foot of the Iron Throne, his eyes fixed on the jagged blades that made up its cruel structure. The swords of kings long dead, their jagged edges and twisted forms a grim reminder of the price of power. It was as if the throne itself, with its cold, unyielding presence, was a reflection of the nature of the kingdom. A place where those who sought power would either be forged into rulers of steel or consumed by the very ambition they sought to control. The shadows in the room had deepened with the setting sun, their elongated forms stretching across the floor like silent witnesses to the struggle for control. The torchlight, flickering weakly against the encroaching darkness, cast eerie, distorted shapes on the stone walls. The air, heavy with the scent of aged wood and old secrets, seemed to cling to him, suffocating in its stillness. Even the cool breeze that filtered through the open windows, carrying the faint scent of the sea, felt too distant, too removed from the sharp, suffocating tension of the room. Tyrion's gaze never wavered from the throne as he stood, rooted to the spot. His mind, though, was miles away, caught in the grip of reflection. What had Cersei meant by her words? Power was something one created, she had said, a thing to be owned, to be shaped, molded into the form you desired. But the more Tyrion thought about it, the more it seemed like a cruel illusion, a mirage in a desert that never quite gave you the nourishment you needed. Power was not a thing that could be shaped at will, not something that could be molded into whatever you wished. Power, as he had come to understand it, was like a tempest, something uncontrollable, unpredictable, a force of nature that could either sustain you or sweep you away. What was power without understanding, without wisdom? What was power if it consumed those who held it, slowly, until there was nothing left but ashes? He couldn't stop thinking about his sister, about the rawness of her words and the fervor that had burned behind them. There was something fragile beneath her steely exterior, something human that she fought to keep hidden behind the cold, calculating mask she had so carefully constructed. For all her claims about the throne, Tyrion knew she wasn't just speaking of a seat of power. She was speaking of herself, of her own fear and desire, of her need to control the world around her in order to control the chaos that raged within. Tyrion, too, had known that feeling, the need to hold onto something solid, something real, in a world that often seemed like it was spinning out of control. His entire life had been one of survival, of learning how to bend the world to his will, to maneuver his way through the endless mazes of politics, family, and power. But the more he thought about it, the more he began to question, was he any different than Cersei? Was he too simply grasping at power in an attempt to fill an emptiness that could never be filled? Power wasn't a thing, it was a force, an undercurrent that shaped the very foundations of Westeros. And the more he thought about it, the more it became clear that it wasn't just about controlling the throne, it was about controlling the game itself, understanding the rules and knowing when to break them. There were no clean victories in King's Landing. There was only survival. And sometimes, survival meant sacrificing everything you thought you knew about yourself. As the weight of his thoughts bore down on him, Tyrion finally broke the silence that had settled like a heavy fog over the room. His voice, though quiet, held a conviction that had not been there before. "Perhaps we all play at the Game of Thrones," he muttered to himself, his words lost in the cold stillness of the chamber. "But the true cost is not in the victories we claim or the defeats we suffer. It is in the moments when we stop knowing who we are, when we stop understanding what we've become in the pursuit of it all." Tyrion's hand gripped the stone of the throne's base, the rough texture digging into his skin as if the very seat itself were pulling him into its orbit. He could feel the ghosts of the past in every corner of the room, in every crack in the stone, in the dust that had settled over the centuries. There were no clean victories in King's Landing, only the remnants of those who had come before, their dreams and ambitions long forgotten, their names reduced to whispers in the halls of history. Could he, too, become a part of that forgotten history? Could the very pursuit of power blind him to everything else, until he, too, was consumed by it, as his father had been, as his siblings had been? Or was there another way, a way that did not require the destruction of everything you were, everything you loved? The sound of footsteps interrupted his thoughts, heavy, deliberate, and though Tyrion's mind was already racing with the consequences of his own reflections, his body remained still, as if frozen in the moment. He knew who it was before the door creaked open, before the figure entered, their presence as inevitable as the rising of the sun. Jaime. Tyrion turned slowly, his gaze meeting his brother's without a word. The air between them was thick with the years of shared history, of blood, betrayal, and silent understanding. Jaime, the golden lion, the knight who had once been the pride of the family, stood in the doorway with a mixture of defiance and weariness in his eyes. His armor gleamed in the dim light, but the wear on his face, the hollow look in his gaze, betrayed the weight of the burdens he carried, the same burdens that Tyrion carried whether he wanted to admit it or not. "Still contemplating the throne, I see," Jaime said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. Tyrion's lips twisted into a wry smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "What else is there to do in this place but contemplate it?" he replied, his voice soft, almost thoughtful. "There are no true answers to be found here, Jaime. Only questions. And the more I seek to answer them, the more I find myself lost." Jaime stepped forward, his boots scraping against the cold stone floor, his gaze never leaving Tyrion. "I've come to offer you a piece of advice," he said after a long moment, his voice quiet but filled with something deeper, something that Tyrion could not fully place. "You don't need the throne, Tyrion. You don't need to play this game, not the way they do. There are other paths where you don't have to lose everything. Tyrion's brow furrowed as he took in his brother's words. He had never seen Jaime so vulnerable, so unguarded. The hardened knight, the one who had always been the paragon of strength and honor, now seemed smaller, more fragile. Tyrion had always understood his brother's need to prove himself, to live up to the expectations of their father, to protect Cersei. But this was something different. "You speak as though there is a way to win without playing the game," Tyrion said, his voice carrying a tinge of disbelief. "But in this world, Jaime, there is no escape. There is only the game, and the sooner you accept that, the sooner you stop fighting it, the sooner you'll see that survival is the only victory worth having." Jaime's eyes softened, and for a moment Tyrion thought he saw a flicker of understanding in his brother's gaze, a quiet acknowledgement of the battle that both of them had fought and would continue to fight in their own ways. "Maybe you're right," Jaime said after a long pause, his voice almost a whisper. "But even in this game, there's room for something else. There's room for more than just surviving. Don't forget that." And with those words, Jaime turned and walked out, leaving Tyrion alone with the throne, the weight of his thoughts, and the undeniable sense that, somehow, the game had only just begun. The morning light crept slowly through the high windows of the Red Keep, casting thin, trembling beams across the cold stone floor. The torches, though still flickering in the corners of the halls, could not keep the chill of the stone at bay, and the very air of the castle seemed to carry the weight of centuries, thick with the dust of forgotten kings and their broken dreams. The deep, echoing silence of the keep was always present, but today it felt particularly oppressive, as though the world had been holding its breath for far too long. Even the creaking of the ancient wooden beams which normally gave the castle its air of age-old grandeur now seemed mournful, as if the very walls themselves were growing weary of their long and storied history. Tyrion walked slowly down the long corridor, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpets that lined the floor. The faint glow of morning light caught the polished stone walls, their surfaces scarred by the passage of time, just as the faces of those who had once walked these halls were now fading into obscurity. It was a place of power, yes, but also a place of entropy, where the grandeur of the past had begun to decay under the weight of the present. Tyrion couldn't help but think of how fleeting everything truly was. The Iron Throne, the crown, the wars, the victories. How much of it was simply smoke and mirrors? How much of it was truly real, and how much was a fragile illusion waiting to collapse under its own weight? The faint sound of footsteps echoed ahead of him, and Tyrion knew, even before he rounded the corner, that it was Cersei. Her presence in the halls of the Red Keep was almost like a constant storm, her aura crackling with the sharpness of her anger, her ambition, and her unrelenting need to control everything around her. He had come to learn her rhythms, to understand the subtleties of her movements, the sharpness of her words, and the cold precision of her gaze. But today, as he approached her, he sensed something different in the air, a tension, a heaviness that seemed to hang between them like a storm waiting to break. When she turned the corner, her gaze met his with a quiet intensity that made the air between them feel even thicker. She didn't speak immediately. Instead, she studied him, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly, as though searching for something beneath the calm surface of his expression. Tyrion felt her eyes on him, a familiar weight that made him wish for just a moment that he could step back, escape the ever-present pressure of her gaze. But there was no escape. Not in this place. Still chasing ghosts, Tyrion? Cersei's voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried the sharpness of a knife edge. She stepped closer, the scent of her perfume, a mix of roses and lavender clinging to the air between them. It was a scent that always reminded him of her, of the parts of her he had both admired and feared, the parts that had always been so carefully crafted, so perfectly orchestrated. Tyrion looked at her, his face impassive but his mind racing. "I chase nothing, Cersei. I merely observe," he replied, his voice steady, though there was a flicker of something darker in his chest, something that made him question his own words. He had spent his entire life observing, hadn't he? Watching, learning, understanding the power dynamics, understanding the people who held those powers. But where had that gotten him? To the Iron Throne, perhaps. But at what cost? What had he truly gained? Cersei's lips curled into a smile, but there was no warmth in it. "Observing?" she repeated, as if the word tasted foreign on her tongue. "That's your method, is it? To stand by and watch as others play the game, while you simply comment from the sidelines?" "No, Cersei," Tyrion said slowly, his voice betraying a touch of bitterness that he couldn't entirely suppress. "I don't stand by and watch. I play the game just as you do. But I don't make the mistake of thinking that I can control it. You, my sister, believe that you can, and it blinds you to what you are, to what this place is." Her gaze flickered for a moment, the briefest flicker of doubt, before her eyes hardened again. "You think you know me, Tyrion," she said, her voice quiet but thick with a simmering anger. "You think you can see through me, understand me because of some twisted bond that binds us together. But you have no idea, do you? You don't know the cost of this power, the price I have paid for it." Tyrion looked at her closely, his thoughts pulling in 1,000 directions. Her words cut deeper than he had expected, and he could see it now. There was a rawness beneath her carefully crafted exterior, a deep well of emotion that she had spent her entire life suppressing. It was a feeling he understood well. Power, after all, was often not about strength or strategy. It was about the ability to control one's emotions, to bury them beneath the weight of one's ambition. "You're right about one thing, Cersei," Tyrion said softly, taking a step closer to her, though his voice remained steady. "You have paid a price, but so have I. So have we all. And the question is, what is that price worth?" Cersei's eyes flickered in a way that betrayed her guarded composure. "What do you mean?" she asked, her tone softer now, though still sharp. "I mean this, Cersei," Tyrion said, his words slower now, his gaze unwavering. "We fight for the throne, we fight for power, but what is it really for? A crown, a title? Or is it something more, something deeper? A desire for control over everything and everyone around us. You want the throne, but you don't just want it for yourself. You want it to prove something, to prove to everyone who ever doubted you that you are worthy, and that is what will destroy you in the end." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and undeniable. Cersei's expression faltered for just a moment, and for the briefest of moments Tyrion thought he saw something like regret in her eyes, a flicker of vulnerability that she had spent a lifetime trying to suppress. But it vanished as quickly as it had come, replaced by the cold, hard exterior she had so... "You know nothing of what I want," she snapped, her voice laced with venom again. "You speak as though you understand my every thought, my every motive, but you don't. You never have." Tyrion sighed softly, his gaze never leaving hers. "No," he said quietly, "I don't, but I understand the game, and I understand that power, true power, can never be controlled. It can only be used, and even then it is fleeting. The moment you think you've mastered it, it slips through your fingers like sand." There was a long pause as Cersei absorbed his words, her eyes narrowing as she took a step back. She didn't speak immediately, her thoughts seemingly distant, her mind racing with the weight of everything that had been said. Tyrion could see the way her posture softened, if only for a moment. Her rigid stance now more vulnerable, more aware of the reality of her situation. "I didn't ask for your advice, Tyrion," she said finally, her voice quieter now, but no less forceful. "But I'm afraid I'll take it anyway, because I have no other choice." Tyrion nodded slowly, his eyes not leaving hers. "That's the thing about power, Cersei. It forces you into choices you never thought you'd have to make, and once you make them, there's no going back." With that, Cersei turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing down the corridor like the fading sound of a distant storm. Tyrion remained standing there, his mind whirling with the words they had shared. The game was not just about power, he realized. It was about the choices you made, the sacrifices you were willing to accept in order to secure your place in this world. And as he watched her disappear into the distance, he couldn't help but wonder, was he ready to make those sacrifices? Or was he already too deep in the game to turn back? The days that followed were a blur of strategy and silence, each moment a careful balancing act between the looming presence of the Iron Throne and the increasingly fragmented web of alliances and betrayals that Tyrion had come to navigate with grim determination. King's Landing had always been a place of sharp edges, of men and women who wore masks of civility while sharpening their knives behind closed doors, but now it felt as though the very foundation of the city had begun to crack under the pressure. There was a tension in the air, a weight that pressed down on every interaction, every conversation. No one, it seemed, was free from the looming shadow of impending change. Tyrion walked the halls of the Red Keep with a quiet purpose, his every step measured, his every glance sharp, as though the walls themselves might hold secrets that could shift the balance of power at any moment. The castle, though beautiful in its architecture, felt like a trap more than a home. The vast high ceilings and narrow stone corridors were oppressive, almost suffocating, their coldness a constant reminder of the stone upon which the weight of kingdoms rested. The subtle shift of shadows cast by the flickering torchlight seemed to echo the turmoil brewing in his mind, the battle between his intellect and his desires, between the loyalty to his family and the distant vision of a throne that, with every passing day, seemed more elusive, more dangerous. And yet, through all of it, Tyrion could not shake the thought that perhaps he had already won. Perhaps, like the spider that waited in the shadows, the real victory lay in what he had been able to understand, not just about power, but about people. He had learned to read them, to understand their fears and desires, their weaknesses and their strengths. Power, he now realized, was not a thing to be claimed. It was a delicate game of perception, a reflection of who others believed you to be, not what you truly were. He had survived thus far because he understood that more deeply than anyone else in this city. And yet, even with this knowledge, there was no escaping the fact that the game was nearing its final move. Joffrey, with his petulant cruelty, still sat upon the throne, and his actions, unpredictable and violent, made it clear that his reign would be short. But that did not make it any less dangerous. The kingdom was a powder keg, and each spark could set it ablaze. Tyrion had spent enough time with his nephew to know that Joffrey was not only a boy of cruelty, but one of impulse. His power, if it could be called that, came not from wisdom or calculation, but from fear. And fear, as Tyrion knew all too well, was a weak foundation on which to build a throne. No one could stand on fear forever, not even a king. Power built on fear had a way of crumbling, of turning to dust in the hands of those who held it. As he approached the throne room that day, Tyrion found himself at a crossroads, one of many he had faced in his life, but this one felt different, as if the outcome of this particular game would determine everything. Cersei's words, her icy determination to claim control over the throne, still echoed in his mind, but now they were tempered by something else, something more contemplative. Her pursuit of power was a relentless force, but it was also a pursuit of something deeper, a need for validation, for respect, for something beyond the throne itself. The very thing that Tyrion had long sought, validation from his family, from his father, from the world, was the very thing that had driven her to the brink. Tyrion paused outside the throne room doors, the weight of everything pressing down on him. For a moment, the familiar darkness of the room felt suffocating. The cold stone walls, the towering archways, the feeling that the entire place was one misstep away from collapsing, all seemed to close in on him. He closed his eyes, allowing himself a fleeting moment of respite, a moment of silence in which he could hear only the steady rhythm of his own breathing. What was it all for? What had he truly achieved in this game? Was it the throne that mattered most? Or was it the knowledge that he had played the game with skill, with subtlety, and had managed to carve out his own place in a world that had always dismissed him as little more than a fool? Lord Tyrion. A voice broke through his thoughts, and he opened his eyes to see Podrick standing before him, his usual anxious expression betraying his usual reluctance to disturb his master's thoughts. "What is it, Podrick?" Tyrion asked, his voice softer now, with the weight of many thoughts pressing down on his chest. "A message from the king, my lord," Podrick said, handing him a piece of parchment. Tyrion took the paper and unfolded it, reading the words with a quiet intensity. It was a summons to the throne room. Joffrey had grown bored again, it seemed, and now the game was calling him back into the fray. The clock was ticking. With a final, deep breath, Tyrion folded the letter and tucked it into his cloak. The path before him was uncertain, fraught with danger and deception, but it was the only path he could take. There was no turning back. He knew that as he walked into the throne room, the game would take its final turn, and it was no longer just about survival. It was about becoming the one who understood it all. And in that moment, Tyrion understood something more profound than any victory or defeat. It wasn't about the throne, it was about the freedom to choose how you played the game, and what you were willing to sacrifice to win. The throne room doors swung open, and Tyrion stepped inside, his gaze meeting the cold, hard reality of the Iron Throne, standing alone in the center of the room, surrounded by the whispers of history and the ghosts of the men who had sat there before. He had played the game better than most, but now the final move awaited. "Ah, uncle!" Joffrey's voice rang out, high-pitched and full of the arrogance that came with youth, with power handed to him without merit. "Come, sit with me. I have more games to play." Tyrion's lips curled into a faint smile, his eyes cold but calculating as he walked toward the throne. "You do, my dear nephew," he said softly, "but so do I."